All right. It's great to see you, everybody. Again, I'm Steph Milbourne. I'll be moderating this, but I'm going to be mostly trying to get out of the way and let you all ask questions and make comments, because that's been really cool so far to hear the things people have to say. So we've got an active chat going. Don't hesitate to continue with that chat. So the general format, we've got about 85 minutes. The general format is that we asked the three panelists to share their thoughts generally about advancing health lifestyles theories for 10 minutes or so. In reality, we could take a little bit longer than that, but what I'll do, if it's all right, is I'll give everyone a verbal 2-minute warning at 12 minutes and try to keep track of time there. But we wanted to make it really open-ended because these three panelists are, this is going to be amazing to hear what's in their brain about this topic. So that's going to be great. I'll just go in alphabetical order if that's all right. And then after that, we'll open it up for people to ask questions, comments. I have a few questions, but they're probably going to be less interesting than the things that you all have to bring up. And so we'll try to open up the conversation that way. So please don't be shy, and not that you have been as a group, which is fabulous, but please continue not to be shy. And we'll turn to our panelists first here to speak generally on the topic of where do we go next? Where are we? What's our future for thinking about health lifestyles theories? So Sarah, are you willing to kick us off?
Sure. I do have just 3 slides, so don't worry. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And I'll start by just saying that I have studied food practices and feeding practices related to health for the last 10 years, but I don't really see myself as like in the health lifestyles paradigm. So I hope these will be helpful, but I am definitely an outsider. So I'm curious and a little nervous, honestly, to see what everyone has to say. And also I really enjoyed the panel talks yesterday, and then I had to go to a meeting, and it is a special treat because I lived in Sweden for a year in 2018, and I was in Peter's department. So that was an interesting coincidence, and also that experience, because a lot of things related to health were so different in Sweden, really gave me a lot to think about. So I am just going to talk about 3 things that I've been thinking about related to health. I thought about them yesterday and hearing the keynotes, and that are kind of tied to some of my research, which, as I said, I've done qualitative research with poor and working class families in the South, mostly the Southern US, for the last 10 years. And a lot of it is about how people feed their families and think about health and things related to that. So the first one is thinking a little bit more about symbolic meaning. And this came up a lot yesterday, which I appreciated, but kind of thinking about it maybe slightly differently. So we heard a lot about, and this seems pretty clear, that certain health practices convey cultural capital. And so, for example, related to food, eating organic food, or even just having children that eat a very wide range of foods, that have a very diverse palate, is associated with wealth and cultural capital. So in terms of which kind of parents have the money and resources and time to make this happen, and then also because it conveys something about those families and their children in terms of what kind of parents they are and what kind of kids they're raising. So we've got that, but the question I want to raise is the other direction, that we assume that certain practices are healthy, and we also assume the converse because of their association with certain groups. So when a white, middle class, or wealthy audience group of people eats it, we assume that it's healthy, whether that's true or not. So I'm just going to give one example. I teach a class called Food and Society in North Carolina, and every year we start out, and I have all of my students, they list a bunch of foods they associate with cuisine, and then I make a word cloud, and we kind of analyze it and talk about it. And one year, collard greens was in the list. So it came up like right in the middle of the word cloud, which I loved because it was so Southern. And I posted on Facebook, and some of my Facebook friends who were mostly not from the South, they started talking like, that's so weird. Collard greens, aren't collard greens unhealthy? How do you make collard greens? And there was it was very clear stigma about like, how do you prepare that? And I think that's not just my Facebook friends, I have to say. And so collard greens are stigmatized as something that's made with pork fat and that it's tied to these other unhealthy foods. But of course, kale, which is, you can see, they're essentially the same, we think of as like the epitome of health and someone who is really trying hard. So that's one question. Like, what does it mean that we praise people, the Whole Foods shoppers, for buying kale, and we stigmatize people who eat soul food for their collard greens? Like, what does it say to them? How does it make them feel about their diet? We know that stigma itself is connected to health. So that's one question. And I think in the public imagination and in policies and maybe even in academia, this like kind of opposite direction, it definitely leads to some like weird questions or skewed priorities. So just to give one example, there was, I do research about family meals, which are widely associated as being contributing to health. And when I give talks about this, when I hear other people talking about it in academic and media audiences, like there's this assumption that it's really poor people that are mostly not cooking at home, that are eating all the fast food. And statistically, that's not true. Poor people eat less fast food than middle-class people because fast food is actually kind of expensive. But people don't even believe that. Like even when you show them the statistics, they still don't believe it. And so I think that sometimes leads to these kind of misplaced questions. But then the last thing I want to think about a little bit is kind of like the last level of this, which is like, can we look at how practices are constructed as healthy or not healthy and think about like the construction of this and what are the implications? So to give one more example, this is a very kind of US specific policy example, but we have the WIC program, which is a nutrition assistance program that gives food vouchers to poor and working class families and WIC and mothers. And WIC statistics suggest that 50% of babies are getting WIC, their families are, when they're born. So this is not a small program, but you get vouchers for specific products that are considered healthy, but are also definitely tied to a very white middle class kind of notion of what healthy means. And so in our study, we had all of these, we have a lot of immigrant mothers from Mexico and Central America. They were mostly getting WIC because WIC does not restrict on the basis of citizenship. But the food vouchers, some of them were a little perplexing or vexing for them. So like, for example, you have to use a voucher to buy cereal or you just have to throw it away. And they would say, well, this isn't what we eat. We don't eat cereal in the morning, but that's what the voucher was for. So in pushing these specific norms as healthy, it made the immigrants in our study question whether their actual dietary knowledge really made sense. And it also altered their diets and their children's diets over time. And we know that there's a ton of research on how duration in the US and in many other countries, immigrants is associated with declines in all sorts of health behaviors. And that leads to disparities that then contributes to these programs to fix these problems in the same way that I just talked about. So it's a cycle that perpetuates. And I can't see any of the questions in the chat when I'm sharing my screen. So if anyone needs to, Stephanie, if you need to interrupt me, just let me know. I have one other thing to think through in terms of a potential idea or thought. And this is the idea of fundamental causes, and specifically the idea of racism as a fundamental cause. So the original version of fundamental cause is about SES and about, which I'm sure many of you know, about SES is a fundamental cause of health disparities. And this is because higher SES people deploy different types of resources, knowledge, power, social connections, money, in ways that improve their health, even when health conditions change. So even when it shifts from malnutrition as a cause of ill health to hypertension and heart disease as a cause of ill health, that it's still linked to SES because people are deploying these resources in different ways. And Phelan and Link, the authors of this, they have from 2015 a theory of racism as a fundamental cause. And so, and basically this argument is that racism, as enacted at multiple levels, individual, organizational, or institutional and structural, leads, yes, to racial disparities in SES. So that's part of it, but also to differences in flexible resources that overflow the bounds of SES that are apart from that. And so in their original article, the 2015 one, they talk about non-occupational prestige and power, social connections, and freedom. And they show that this is linked to health. And giving just an example of one of theirs, so like racial discrimination itself as a stressor that leads to health disparities. So my colleagues and I have a recent article about food insecurity, which is not exactly the same as health lifestyles, I know, but is connected to some of these things, and how this is linked to how racism as a fundamental cause is linked to food insecurity. And some of the examples are things like racial discrimination over the life course, disruptive life events like school suspensions or job terminations, trauma over the life course, which is things like experiences of violence and incarceration, and the way that racial inequality is built into social structures. For example, that SNAP and welfare, SNAP is food assistance, and welfare programs, financial programs, are more punitive and less generous in the South. And this is linked to like bigger political economic trends that localize assistance and these histories of racist discourse and the politicization of social assistance that have very long histories going back to the post-slavery times. And so this is looking at racism as it links to food insecurity. And I think that some of these pathways are going to come up in relation to other health inequalities. And I will just say that I think that some of these things are definitely distinct to the US. Mass incarceration is an example, which acts as a form of trauma and also directly contributes to differences in material resources that then are linked to health. But I don't think it's just the United States. And just to give an example, from Gothenburg, where I lived when I was based in Peter's department, there was a study that had just come out when I was there that showed differences in life expectancy between different neighborhoods in Gothenburg of like 8 to 10 years difference. And these were neighborhoods with lots of immigrants in them and neighborhoods with few immigrants. And so I think it's worth thinking about in the US and other places, like what are the pathways and what's happening? And I'm nearly sure I'm out of time, essentially. And those were my big questions, but just
You're totally fine, Sarah. Go ahead, take another couple minutes. You're in good shape.
Okay, then I will take like 3 more minutes and leave lots of time for discussion and for other people, because I'm really curious to hear what everyone has to say. So just 2 other, not even really proposals, but sort of questions. And, you know, I'm not sure, maybe some of these have really been covered very thoroughly in the literature, but they're questions I have. So one is about resistance. So one thing that came up a lot yesterday was the way that health discourses can stigmatize and discriminate and shame. And of course, all of the research showing why people can't adopt certain healthy lifestyles and the kind of shame or that they feel in not doing so. But my question is about like whether there've been studies about resistance to certain health practices. And this could be both positive or negative. So positive could be like claiming a food tradition is healthy that the dominant discourse tells you is not healthy. Negative is saying that you're not going to do something because that's what white people do or rich people do or people that aren't like you. And like, for example, Jonathan Metzl, who wrote Dying of Whiteness, which is about white working class Americans and like why they're adopting health behaviors basically that are leading to a decline in their life expectancy related to gun violence or supporting policies that would give them health insurance. Those are forms of resistance. They're not just not being able to do it, but actively resisting. And then my last question is about, you know, and I suspect there is some work on this, but how universal or structural supports affect some of these pathways, and not just the resources and kind of resource disparities, but also the meanings. So in terms of resources, this is kind of obvious, like the dismantling of the social safety net in the US and its localization. As it became more punitive, more localized, you have these bigger disparities between the South and the North, not totally, but yes, that is there. I'm between Black and white Americans in terms of kind of what resources they have access to because of where they live. So that obviously makes sense. If you make it universal, you reduce some of these issues. But I guess my separate question is, how does this affect the meanings that people attribute to healthy lifestyles? And does it become less symbolic when it's more supported across the board? So just to give one example, universal school lunch, which we don't have in the US, but they did have in Sweden. And I think in terms of like supporting families feeding children, which is my main area, will go a long way. So it obviously, it lets everyone have access to food. So it reduces some of those disparities in terms of who can afford healthy food and who can't. It also eliminates the performative aspect of lunch, which we see in lots of places of like, you can't be pressured to pack your kid like a perfect lunch when you don't pack your kid lunch. So that kind of symbolic performative aspect of intensive mothering is gone. But my question is, even so, does it still reinforce like food norms as healthy or good or normal or not? And I think we can see in different places with universal school lunch that sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So I guess that's my last question about how these structural supports might affect not just the resources, which is the first step, but also the meanings and ideas that people associate with them. Thanks.
That was amazing. So thought-provoking. Sarah, I think you'll enjoy getting caught up in the chat with the thoughts that people had that got spurred by what you said. I wanted to take a minute. I meant to introduce folks before they started talking, although now I'm almost thinking it's better to let them talk and then say more about their research. But for those who don't already know Sarah's amazing work, in addition to many other things, I most particularly appreciate the work on parents' feeding practices for their kids, looking at really diverse groups of parents, thinking about race and class and gender together in interesting ways. One is a co-authored book called Pressure Cooker that came out, a couple of years ago, maybe even less. Really, really cool. And then also a really nice article on the double binds that parents face in terms of feeding their children, to where basically you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. But the ways in which the double binds can look different for different parents. So thanks, that was super thought-provoking. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
So I'm guessing that it might make sense for us to get all the panelists to speak, and then we have sort of a big general discussion. Does that make sense to people? Yeah? All right.
Cool.
Let's go with that then. So next up we have Bill Cockerham, who has done amazing and extensive theorizing since, it was 1997, the first one?
It was, come to think of it. Okay.
I just wrote a review that, extensively cited it, so I was hoping I didn't miss something. So,
Okay.
So that's what? That's more than 20.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time of theorizing. And interestingly, there's a new chapter in a new handbook that Bill writes that is coming out this year, or maybe has just come out, 2021 publication date, on health lifestyles and sort of new theoretical ideas combined with all of the rich theory and the sort of bringing past traditions to bear on to thinking about health lifestyles. So if you haven't read Bill's work already, or even if you have, looking at this new 2021 book, the health lifestyles chapter is really, really cool. Okay, I'm going to shut up and let you speak, Bill. Thank you.
Okay, I think you may have lost me just a minute.
Can you hear me okay?
I'm fine. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. I'm back. I've had computer problems through this whole thing in terms of trying to stay connected, but I think I'm okay. But bear with me. I missed a good part of a discussion yesterday, particularly on Terrence's paper on conservatism and the health lifestyles related to the pandemic. And in sort of looking ahead, what I would suggest, what needs to be done, and I think Terrence has already anticipated it, we need to take a look at health lifestyles under the pandemic. And Steph, you've got a slide of mine, I think, on your end, right? This is my basic health lifestyle theory or model. And highlighted in yellow are, I put in under practices, I put in wearing a mask, social distancing, and you can do others such as washing your hands and all the other kinds of things that I had to put up during the pandemic. But the point being is I think we need to extend our thinking and our conceptions about health lifestyles, which were largely based upon thinking and analyzing chronic diseases. We need to extend those to infectious diseases, and in particular, come to understand how health lifestyles operate under the conditions of the current pandemic. That's likely to be a focus of research in medical sociology for the near term, at least for the next few years, as we gather data on what people are doing and what social life has been like, so we can explain how we've adjusted to having to live under the current conditions. I thought Jaron St. Ange made an interesting comment yesterday. You can go ahead and take it off. Anyway, made an interesting comment yesterday, and what little I was able to hear of that particular breakout session about maybe it's a timeout lifestyle. There's a pandemic health lifestyle all of itself, and so we've taken time out from our regular lifestyles to do this. That is, do a modified version of what we used to do, or conversely, maybe we quit. Maybe we don't do the things at all. We drink more. We don't exercise. We eat Cheetos and so forth all the time. We really don't know. But my basic argument, our basic suggestion, is that we've entered a historical period which had a profound effect upon society and a profound effect upon health lifestyles, and we clearly need to adjust our theories to account for this. But at the same time, we need data to show that to show what happened, that is, to be able to describe and perhaps they'd have a model possibly useful in future research should pandemics return, and they may well do it, because as you look at the history of pandemic, we seem to have a new one almost every year. We had Zika, we had Ebola, we've had various versions of Asian flu, MERS, and particularly SARS as a precursor to COVID-19. So basically, if I was going to say, what we need to do to advance theoretical, at least theoretical thinking in the future, is to do more on infectious disease, in particular the current pandemic, so we can understand how human beings socially adapt in relation to their health under these kinds of conditions. So that's sort of my basic argument that I wanted to present today. What I've seen happen recently in terms of I guess modifications or adjuncts to health lifestyle theories, some of the work that Stephanie's doing and her colleagues and Liz on them using life course theories. We do know that health lifestyles do change during the life course, over the life course, but there's also a consistency there that's kind of interesting. And I think that as you get older, they do get locked in. So I would, I think I need to define those a little bit better. And then also, as Sarah mentioned, she went back to fundamental cause theory. Lincoln Phelan has suggested there might be a way to sort of marry or attach health lifestyle theory to fundamental cause theory, at least in relation to the health portion, not necessarily the illness portion of fundamental cause theory. And you can do that. So there are some opportunities here, I think, to blend theories to make it even stronger or better, which is I would also suggest. As far as Stephanie's 4 questions, I thought I'd sort of give my 2 cents worth on those briefly. Stephanie asked, should we be thinking about domains of broader health lifestyles that aren't related to health? Well, when I developed health lifestyle theory, you can actually use it for lifestyles in general. You just take the word health out of it and apply it to some other kind of lifestyle. So, but my focus is on health. I'm a medical sociologist, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. And so that's what I did. But you can, in fact, I think, attach it to analyses of looking at other types of lifestyles that may come in and affect health. So, I think that's an open door that has yet to be developed. The next question is about how can health lifestyles, how can they be used to reproduce social inequalities, or how are they? I thought Peter Quirk did a really good job yesterday of bringing in Bourdieu. And Bourdieu, I think, is the key to understanding social inequalities in health. And I thought, well, I paused for a second and thought, well, are health lifestyles a source of inequality? Sorry about that. Anyway, and they are. I mean, they very well can be. But the key, I think, to going back to that is to look at, Bourdieu's notion of distance from necessity and how that plays over into symbolic meanings and that Sarah talked about. And they are sources of inequality. You wouldn't think they would be, but on reflection, I think it's clear that they are. But I think the best way to get that is to go through Bourdieu to expand on some of his ideas about lifestyles in general. Then there was the notion or the question about incorporating Weber and others' conceptions of consumption, I suppose, as opposed to production. I spent a lot of time on trying to figure that one out. I thought Weber's initial argument that it's not production, there's one's relationship to the means of production, was basically a shot across the bow of Marx. But in working through this, it seems ultimately you have to come out to the end of where it's really, where health lifestyles are really a form of consumption. We don't keep our health. The best we can do with health lifestyles is try to maintain it or make it better. But over time, just through biological aging, clearly we lose our health, at least in some form or fashion, until eventually, of course, it kills us. So, my argument in the theory was that, well, while production is important and production and consumption are clearly linked, it's really a form of consumption because we use it for something, and we do, and so I've been trying to sort of reverse think it to say, well, let's just start. It's really production, it's not consumption. But I think when you really work through it and try to get to the final decision of something, I really think it's consumption. But although on the surface it's almost illogical, because, well, what do you mean you're not consuming it? You're producing it. Well, yeah, but you're producing it to use it, and it goes, and so you have to sort of keep up. So you've got to do something, and because it is consumed. I don't know if that makes a great deal of sense. It's sort of a stream of consciousness approach to it. But anyway, I go with consumption. But somebody wants to come up with a better way to do this, it will be my guest. And then the final question about what important is about health lifestyle theories are not being adequately explored. Again, I think it's the pandemic, and I think it's the neglect and I'm certainly guilty of this, of infectious diseases, because they've certainly come back in a big way. And the notion that infectious diseases, which was widely known, I think, or well known, that we had a Surgeon General in the late 60s who said, forget it, that infectious diseases are basically cured. And that's over. Telling medical students that you really don't want to go on infectious diseases because there's nothing left to do, that period is clearly over too. So infectious diseases, as we have seen, not just currently in the present pandemic, but in the history of, going back to AIDS, for example, when it's first emerged, and then marching forward with all the different pandemics we've had, and we've had a bunch of them. And again, we have them almost every year, or at least every other year, something new. Infectious diseases are with us. And we need to do a better job, I think, at least as a medical sociologist, to explain health lifestyles under pandemic conditions or even localized epidemics. So basically that's it for the time being. Okay.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. Yeah, trying to think about health lifestyles in relationship with the pandemic is so interesting. And it's really great that we were able to get some work on that presented, including Terrence Hill's work presented in the roundtables yesterday. And it's fabulous to think about these thoughts because I think you're totally right, Bill, that we've primarily been using a chronic illness lens to think about health lifestyles, but that doesn't mean it's not useful when you start thinking with a lens that's broader and includes infectious diseases. It's opens up a lot of new ideas.
Well, one thing I'm trying to do now, even over the data, is look at when did the pandemic become social? At what point when the pandemic began to evolve and enter the wet market? It's when it entered the wet markets. It actually goes back to Chinese culture and their desire for exotic and extremely fresh foods. That's when the social begins in the pandemic. But the biological is only half the story or part of the story. The social plays a huge role in this pandemic, obviously. So that's one thing I'm trying to play around now.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna shut up for a while, let you guys go on.
And there were no internet disruptions. Terrific. Yay.
No, yeah, it was. It's a small miracle.
Worked out great.
Okay.
So our third panelist is equally fabulous. I'm really excited to introduce Adrienne Freck from Mizzou, who I think of as one of the most important life course scholars when thinking about health behaviors. And so Adrienne has published in a lot of related areas and has really rich work about families, gender, race, class, many different things. I think one of the most interesting kinds of work that she's done is thinking about trajectories of health behavior as people move from adolescence into adulthood during this really turbulent time when so much happens in terms of health behaviors, and investigating the role of social support in particular. So there's a piece from Advances in Life Course Research 2012 that I think is particularly lovely at disentangling these things. So Adrienne, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. I'll go ahead and share screen. I only have a few slides, but they help organize me, which I think will work out better for all of us. So I moved to a health sciences department a few years ago. And so here at University of Missouri, I'm in health sciences and not sociology. And that's affected the journals that I publish in, and it's affected the kind of research that I do. And what I wanted to talk about today is what has happened to the way that I use theory and how I think that reflects something that happens to a lot of us health scholars. And so in thinking about what I wanted to do with this 10 minutes, I thought, well, how can I start a conversation about what happens to theory when health scholars move from more traditional sociology journals into interdisciplinary research? And so I'll give an example from one of my studies, and then hopefully we can have a conversation about how to keep theory in interdisciplinary research. And I want to start by just, reinforcing how and I think many other people use theory. And the first thing that I think is important is, if we are scholars of health behaviors, if you're studying sleep, alcohol use, cigarette smoking, we're not necessarily in conversation with the epi people or the neuroscience people. We don't necessarily want to be. We're having sociological conversations about what these behaviors reflect, about the tension between agency and social inequality. And so theory helps us have that conversation and keep that conversation sociological. In a very practical way, theory helps me to cast a net when I'm model building. And so if you have really sound theories like health lifestyles theory that have conceptual diagrams where you can really say, how do I make sure this theory is testable? How do I test specific parts of this theory? And so theory really helps me to kind of say, what variables belong in this model? When should they be measured? how do they help me make sure that I'm participating in the bigger conversation that sociologists are having about these health outcomes? And again, as I move into publishing in more interdisciplinary journals, theory helps to remind me how I am continuing to be a sociologist first and foremost, that I'm not just studying alcohol use or cigarette smoking or sleep. I'm studying sociology, and I'm talking about how those represent not individual choices. They represent the tension between social structure, agency, how that changes across the life course, and how the interventions that we propose or the things that we suggest are the causes are never individual choice causes, which is a conversation you always have if you're talking to people in schools of medicine. And so here's what happens is that, our journals are very prestigious. And if you have a finding that you have tried to publish in JHSB or ASR or Social Science and Medicine, and you haven't hit any of those journals, we're lucky as health scholars that we can then turn to the more health-oriented journals and try and publish in American Journal of Epidemiology or in specialty journals that relate to those outcomes that we're studying. But the first thing that you have to do is cut your manuscript from 8,000 or 9,000 words down to 3,000 words. And what's the first thing that you kick out? It's the theory. And so you kind of wind up stripping your finding from something where you are participating in that bigger sociological conversation to what, to me, feels like I have an independent and a dependent variable that no one's tested yet. Here's how I've tested it. I've added a tiny piece to what we didn't already know about the evidence base, but I haven't given back to the theory. I haven't advanced the theory. I haven't demonstrated my test of the theory in the same way. And this is the thing I'd really like to talk about if we have time is what are some strategies that we can use as we publish in an interdisciplinary way to make sure that we can kind of talk back to those theories. And so I'll give one example of how this has happened recently, which is that with Dimitri Tuman and some other collaborators, we were looking at the role of improving technology in left ventricular assist devices and how that affects race disparities in heart transplant outcomes. And so I know, sounds super medical, super technical, but it's actually a great test of fundamental cause theory because medical devices like LVADs, and LVADs are a durable implanted device that help your left ventricle pump blood throughout your body. And the main thing to know about them is like any other medical device, they improve over time. And fundamental cause theory has already shown us that as technology improves, that technology reaches more advantaged people first. But what we really wanted to do was add back to fundamental cause theory and say, it's not just that, or if you look at that, you don't see everything, which in itself is part of fundamental cause. You can't just look at the inequality in just one place. We actually find that as LVADs improved, Black and white patients with heart failure were equally likely to get the new devices. Where we found the disparity, where we really wanted to kind of speak back to fundamental cause, was that Black patients got the devices when they were sicker than white patients. And so new technology reached Black and white patients with the same speed, but at different points in the disease course. And so this idea of technological intervention vis-a-vis how sick you are was something we really wanted to add back to fundamental cause. But we couldn't because in the end, we wound up publishing in a transplant journal. And not just with word limitations, but there are all kinds of limitations in some of these journals, including how old your citations are allowed to be. And so if I couldn't really find a fundamental cause article that was published in the last 5 years, it was very hard to cram it into the references section. We were allowed, I think, to have 20% of our references more than 5 years old. And so that's just one of the tiny things. But, and so we published this finding, I'm very happy with this finding. And in the end, I do think we can tell a fundamental cause story about it when I present on it, for example. But the final published work doesn't cite fundamental cause literature at all. And so that's always, it's a little bit of a loss for me when that happens. And that's kind of why I want to talk about it. But it's not just a loss for me personally. I think that it kind of costs us as a discipline. So here's Another manuscript we have, this isn't published yet. Sydney Johnson is actually an undergraduate student at East Carolina University who wrote this while kind of working on medical school applications. And what we found here is that looking at review articles that are indexed by Scopus, so review articles that are published in more medical journals, that do reviews of the social determinants of health, don't just not address fundamental cause. They don't cite sociology or sociology journals. And the best predictor that we had for whether social science findings are making their way into review articles of the social determinants of health in journals indexed by Scopus is having a social scientist as a co-author on the paper that wrote the review. And so we do have to just physically be in there, helping to write these studies, helping to kind of keep forcing our findings into the literature. Because right now, social determinants of health in the medical journals, in the more medical fields, continues to be this idea that it's just a bunch of theories you pack together into a stepwise regression, and whatever doesn't get kicked out of the stepwise regression is your social determinants of health. And we lose a lot when that happens. And we are doing meaningful and important work that relates back to the core ideas of sociology. And so I would really like to hear people's thoughts about how to keep those in our publications as we publish in more interdisciplinary journals.
That is fascinating. Thank you. Thanks so much to our three panelists. I think that this has been just super, super interesting to hear the different things that you all have had to say. I guess before we open the floor entirely, why don't we stick with the topic Adrian's asking about here, right? Like, I think this is a really important, and Jaron just pointed out that apparently the majority of us here, or at least a lot of people in the session, are outside of sociology departments doing this kind of work. And so, you know, can we tackle this for a minute? How do we, for example, take ideas about health lifestyles and get them out into the quote unquote medical mainstream where at least they're gonna get cited or indexed in Scopus? Kate.
So thank you all three. My head is exploding. So many things to say. I mean, this really resonates with me from someone who sits within public health and who is constantly trying to bring theory to public health. I've spent the last 25 years of my career trying to do this. What I would say to you and anybody else, the graduate students, is try to publish in both. Try to publish the same thing in both. One that's really fulsomely theoretical, and one that's stripped down because you have to. It will bring in two audiences, but sometimes those audiences find themselves in the same space. And then they can make the connections between the two. So that's the first thing I would suggest. The second thing I would suggest is go to both of the conferences. Go to the sociology conferences, go to the public health or medical conferences. I have given talks at the American Public Health Association conference, which is really pretty theory-less, and blown away audiences who will walk away and go, wow, okay, what do I do with this? That's enough. If we get a group of people thinking and curious, it's enough. You'll be an outsider, but it's okay. We're in it together. But try to go to both. I think that's really important to keep the conversation. Conversation has to start somewhere.
Can I add something to that? I think sociology is a big part of the problem. Sociology as a discipline is very elitist, and I'm in a social department, but I regularly publish in public health and medical journals, but I am also punished for that by my colleagues because they don't see the merit in doing that type of work. So one of the problems that we need to address in sociology is figuring out a way to address that elitism and the insecurities about publishing outside of sociology. And I try to explain to my colleagues all the time that if we could publish in other fields, people would see the value of sociology more, and our value would be clearer to everyone. But most of my colleagues that are, what I would call essentially elitist, insular elitists, they only want you to publish in sociology and to talk to other sociologists, but they don't understand how that limits the value. And that's why nobody knows what sociology is.
Can I make a small, like, it's like maybe like a devil's advocate type counterpoint? I'm in a sociology department, and I pretty regularly work with like, researcher clinician type individuals, and social determinants of health is obviously a big focus of their work, especially dealing with childhood obesity. And they talk about all the same issues that I think we're worried about as sociologists and demographers. But yeah, as was noted, they might not use the theories that we're talking about. And I'm sitting there and it's like, oh, that's kind of a bummer, like, that they're not explicitly saying fundamental cause or something like that. But I do like take a step back and think like, but they are talking about it. I agree with them. Kind of like they're not using the theory. So I guess my question is kind of like, I kind of stop and say like, well, what is the problem? Like they haven't used my theory. I'm a little upset about that, but they're using the ideas, and does that matter more? Like I said, I'm in a sociology department. I want them to talk about it, but I also understand that if I really care about like the greater good, is that so much of a problem? That's just kind of
there's also a division of labor that we need to consider. Public health and medicine have very different goals than sociology, and so I just wonder if we should change. I would like to change the value system of sociology to be compatible with what you're talking about. That we could be concerned with issues of public health and public safety as a part of our value system in sociology.
Yeah, I think I can speak back to this a little bit. I think the theories that we use talk about the solutions that are possible and the nature of the problem. And so I was a co-I on a grant here about childhood obesity. And the grant dealt with home visits. And again, using this idea of like a stepwise regression where you cram in a bunch of social determinants of health variables. And then the variables that are kind of left in the model are the ones that are determined to be the problem. And so the idea was that in order to kind of target childhood obesity, if it turns out that mother's own behaviors or mother's communication to the child were the things that kind of fit the model best, that was the thing they proposed as the solution. And virtually every social theory tells us that you can't just tell a mother to change her behaviors in order to then change the way a child eats or change a child's weight. So it doesn't have to be called fundamental cause theory, but our theories tell us that the problem is in like aspects of social inequality and is distinctly outside the realm of individual change. And so if there's anything we can do to kind of keep that part of it in, even if it's not calling it the theory we want to call it, that's the thing I want to see make its way into the more medical or medically oriented journals and the medically oriented conversation.
I'll just throw in a couple of personal experiences, that making a transition to working with a lot of, as a grad student, I always dreamed of working with physicians on this population health stuff. And then I got that chance and really got more than I'd ever bargained for, which is, that so many physicians don't even, I work with a ton who really don't even buy into social determinants of health. Like that's how far the gap can be. Just to echo the points that are being made, I think we've got to find ways to chop these ideas up and get them into digestible short pieces. Like nobody on the medical side or very few on the medical side are going to read a 35-page article with, from JHSB or something. It's just not going to happen. And, just another kind of funny anecdote is when I first made that transition, I remember bringing to some of my colleagues, like 6 regression models with, here I added gender, here I added income. And they were just like, what is this? Like, we don't do this. It's like, you do unadjusted and you do adjusted. And like, they don't care what makes the effect, and that just goes to show just the very different orientations. But anyway, I could talk a lot more about that, but I will let others chime in.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it is due to the grant funded nature too. I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with just grant mechanisms and the lack of incorporating grants. I mean, again, drawing on personal experiences, I know that's the first thing to get cut from grants, and that's not necessarily what people want to see. They want the outcome. So I think that drives this as well.
Let me jump in here just 1 second. I've got a little bit of experience with this. Even though I'm retired, I'm still on a grant, UAB in preventive medicine. And we found that, for one thing, that physicians, they don't know how to do what we do. We may not know how to do what they do, but frankly, that's not my interest. Doesn't really make a lot of difference to me. But we were able to teach them a great deal. We found attitudes changing. At first it was, like, why are you here kind of a response. And now it's, well, thank you, we learned a lot. And so working together in interdisciplinary teams with physicians can be used. So we put out a special issue of the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. I'll hold it up. It's got a lot of theory in it, and it has articles by sociologists. I'm not saying you can, it takes resources to be able to get a journal to give you a special issue. And I'm not really sure how much, I think the grant itself had to put a little money in the pot to get them to do this. But the fact is, I think it's changing. That's my basic point, that social determinants of disease is becoming a more popular topic, even though some physicians may not accept it or understand it. It may seem to be a strange thing to say to understand, but I think some of them don't. I think we have a lot to bring to medicine. We actually came out of medicine, if you look at the history of medical sociology. And so I think there's always been a sort of a basic interest in society and health on the medical side, but we're in a state of transition in which we're becoming, I think, more and more important as a discipline in relation to medicine. But that's may not necessarily be the case at all, in all medical schools, all universities, all healthcare centers, and so forth. But looking at how it was years ago, it's much better now. And the medical profession seems to be much more receptive to what we're saying, what we're finding in our research that complements theirs. And at the same time, if you're skillful, you can bring in a little theory too. But the point Jared made, they don't. It may have been justified, but anyway, it's the fact that they don't read. That's true. They don't read long things. So you don't want to write a long article that's going to keep their interest. They want something quick, fast, and short, basically. So it's important, I think, for us to develop the skills to address those kinds of papers and articles. But I think we're getting there. I'm more positive than I am negative about our relationship with interdisciplinary work. Okay.
Thank you all. It's great to have this conversation, and there's interesting things going on in the chat in case you haven't seen about recommending different kinds of conferences. And I'm writing a lot of notes because there are conferences coming up I had not heard of. So why don't we open up the floor more broadly? Anyone like to ask a question of the panelists in general, or any of the panelists? I see Kate's hand up, and if people can also raise their virtual hand, that'll make it easier to see who's first. But Kate, why don't you start, and then Rick will be next.
So I have a comment for both of the other speakers. I just don't want to, maybe I'll just make them both and then open up the conversation. So the first is for Bill, particularly about the issue of consumption. Lifestyles as a form of consumption. I just want to share with you some more recent work that I've been doing on children's free play, actually, and the way in which free play, or the idea of play, has become a social practice that's an object of interest to public health. So until about 15 years ago, no one in public health would have even uttered the word play. And it has suddenly become an object of interest to public health and perhaps to sociology, because of its utility for getting kids to move and to reduce potentially obesity. And one of the things that we have come across in our work on free play is that part of the reason we propose that people are, or kids are being encouraged to free play less is that increasingly parents are seeing the activities that their children should be doing as something that they consume. So for instance, it is seen to be virtuous, particularly by the middle class, to have their children very early on, like as babies, in classes, to learn to swim, to learn to do whatever, that in order to be a good child, a good parent, one has to consume some knowledge, some practice in order to create the right kind of child. And so the idea of free play, which is an oxymoron, right? Play is itself free, or should be itself free, is seen as nonsense or as a waste of time, because there's no if you look at it in terms of consumption terms, there's no consumption there. It's something that is done outside of the realm of consumption. So it's just something that I want to raise as an interesting, and I think it's at the basis of lifestyles, is that especially modern lifestyles, this notion that we as good citizens consume something, and going back to the kale and collard, that is good for us, is very much a part of our whole, should be a part of our theoretical thinking about it. And it's very useful as a way of moving it forward. So I just want to share that with Bill. If I may, I'm just going to move over to the other issue that I wanted to raise with Sarah. I loved the first slide on collard greens and kale. And I just want to share with you my earlier work on smoking, which in which I'm really have been interested about the symbolic meaning of smoking over time and how that has shaped or been shaped by class differences in smoking. So whenever I give a talk on smoking and inequalities, I always start with a fabulous old photo that I found of smoking in the 1920s, where there are a group of very elite white men sitting around smoking with their top hats. And this is the notion that smoking was something virtuous. Smoking was something that white educated men did together to bring them together. It was encouraged even. Fast forward 100 years, and smoking is associated with stupidity, with dirtiness, with low class. And so same object, so different from the collard greens and the kale, it's the same object, it's the same cigarette, but in 100 years, the whole meaning around it and the whole notion of who is virtuous in doing it or who is non-virtuous in doing it has changed. So it is what you've given us in your thoughts, Sarah, really important and fundamental to how we think about lifestyles and meaning that we give to objects. I'll stop there.
I'll respond real quick. I thought your comment about producing the right kind of child is really interesting. And even though, and free play, well, is free play totally production? Well, is it? Because you got to have the right kind of shoes, you got to have the right kind of toys. I mean, it may be spontaneous, but little kids just aren't unclothed by themselves in a field, breaking out into some kind of play, at least not today. I guess it's a stretch, admittedly, but you could make a case for, production also, or consumption also enters into this somewhat. Sometime we got time, I wanted to tell me what's going on with Thomas Abel, but that's not a subject of really what we're talking about. But it would be interesting to look at play and to see how, I guess, particularly upper middle class parents are trying to produce the right kind of child through some type of engagement in the so-called right kind of play, whatever that may be. That's actually interesting. I'm very interested. Okay.
Sarah, did you want to say?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think the smoking example is interesting. And I think there are a lot of things like that that have changed over time, like breastfeeding and bottle feeding, like which is the prestigious one, which is the one that's like really investing in your child. Baby food, like, they have, there's a book, this is like food studies, not even sociology, more the cultural aspects, but there were warnings that people were giving to mothers about how irresponsible it was to make your own baby food because you might mess it up and like contaminate your child and kill them. And then like now there's like tied to this intensive parenting that you're talking about, that if you let your child's mouth touch a commercially produced baby food, that you're exposing them to all of this risk, and it's also chemical contamination. So I think it's fascinating, and it's like an interesting thing of it's not just that wealthier people like can keep changing the resources that they deploy to stay on top, but like that the rules of the game just keep changing over time. And I think like related to the point about play and free play, which is tied to like this bigger idea of intensive parenting that Stephanie and others have studied. I think it's true that it's linked to like both intensification of parenting and like investing more in your child, which is itself like an economic term, but also this kind of privatized consumption of activities and food and all sorts of things. And a lot of the literature is in Canada or in the US, and I feel like it's tied to like the stakes that parents perceive for their children. Like, so in the United States, like parents do not assume that their child will necessarily be able to, live a better lifestyle than they did, to make an income, that everything will be fine. And so then these choices made like for babies of like giving your baby French lessons at age 1, they feel so risky. And so like a question I have that I was thinking about like the entire time I was in Sweden is, if you reduce some of the stakes, like, basically you set up a system where if your child does not find a job right away, they might not be totally destitute. Does it reduce some of the intensive parenting pressures? And I'm not sure that it does, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot.
Thanks. I think our next question is from Rick Rogers.
Thanks, Steph. Those were interesting presentations. Really caused me to think about a few different issues. I'd like to bring up 3 related issues. One ties in a little bit with fundamental cause perspective, that in the past, most people have focused on education as one of the most important factors for socioeconomic status related to health. And I wonder if over time, if occupational status becomes a little bit more important, that some of the discussion, especially with the discussion about means of consumption, I'm still a little hesitant to give up a means of production. That when you look at COVID and you see some of the things that have occurred, meatpacking plants, a few different industries that really had a huge impact on infections. I think occupational status, industrial classification may become as, if not more important. So it may rise as an important factor with infectious diseases, especially with something like COVID. Second thought is, I think it's important to look at infectious diseases, to look at COVID. One of the things that I'm intrigued with is in the coming years, what the ramifications are with that. That unlike some infectious diseases where people can recover completely, COVID may have residual effects and may affect chronic conditions. So there may be an interaction between infectious diseases and chronic conditions that we should explore further. And the last point is, I still like to harken back to the idea of the epidemiologic transition theory and hybristic stage, where it's important to look at both chronic and infectious diseases. And one of the things that people often overlook is violence. And violence is quite high in the US. And part of what's happened over the last year with COVID has been that there has been an uptick in violence, both domestic violence, and then homicides. So rather than stick with the dichotomy between infectious, parasitic, and chronic degenerative, we also need to remember violence as a major health factor.
I'll just respond to one point, and then I'm sure other people have other things to add about the occupational status, which I mean, and sector as playing an increasing role. And I think it's interesting that I think about COVID, we've been doing, I didn't talk about this, but interviews with poor and working class families in 5 states during the pandemic, and it's qualitative, and it's focused mostly on food insecurity, but because food is tied to all these other things, we're talking about jobs and school and kids and everything else. And so we're interviewing a lot of essential workers, and not surprisingly, they're talking a lot about the risks, like the physical infectious kind of risks that they face. But then I think it also affects all of these other things. It seems to affect like then how they think about parenting and putting their kids in school. And in the US, like there's this idea that it's poorer parents that are needing to put their kids back in school faster, but it seems like it's actually wealthier parents, it's whiter parents that are doing this a little bit, especially white parents that are doing this more. Whereas some of the essential workers, like in our study, like Black workers in the South, they are keeping their kids out in part because they're exposed to risk at work and they don't want to add on another layer of that risk. And then also I think these job sectors affect the more kind of behavioral things that we've been talking about more. Like, for example, I bring it back to food, of course, but like control over time, which is now becoming this privilege of certain jobs, but not others, is tied to how you feed your kids. It's tied to whether everyone is home at the same time for dinner. And so like lots of low wage service jobs that are becoming more, that like working in fast food, working as retail, and also the gig economy, like that's tied to schedules and not being able to predict that you'll be home at 5 o'clock every day, and to be able to kind of organize your life around certain practices.
Terrence, please.
I was wondering what the group thought about how politics has kind of been infused with institutions of public health as far as recommendations about the pandemic, mask usage, and so forth, and maybe the possibility that social dynamics are going to become increasingly important as our major institutions, political institutions, public health institutions become in various ways corrupted and are losing status in our society.
That's such a great question. Do folks have thoughts? Public health has become political in a different way than a few years before, right? And does that delegitimize it? Like, is it?
I think health has become political more so than ever before. Terrence is on to something here.
Well, you have public health researchers from major universities, going on MSNBC and saying that these types of protests are okay, but these types of protests are not. Misinformation or mixed messaging about masks and about social distancing. It would be nice if we could have just received a consistent message, but there was a political component that has really kind of undermined those institutions, I think. And so where do we get our information about our pandemic lifestyles? Who do we trust about vaccines? Who do we trust about masks or about the concept of herd immunity? Who do we trust?
And I think we can't just blame it on the previous administration, although that obviously hurt it.
Oh, totally. It's definitely been politicized across the spectrum.
Yeah, and everyone, like I see this in the debates about schools and whether it is or is not safe to open schools, and everyone on every side just keeps saying the science, always like that, the capital science. And yeah, it feels kind of bleak when you think about it, because then people don't trust these messages because they keep changing and because they're always framed as like, this is obvious, either you're doing it or you're against science. I don't have any answers, but it's depressing.
Well, we're getting mixed messages. The media, that now they seem to want to tell us what to think. And whenever I hear, particularly following the different types of vaccines that are coming out and what percentage they're effective and so forth and so on, I don't really take any of those reports at face value. And you just don't nowadays, just because of the slant. And again, it tends to be a political slant. You really have to look at many sources to try to figure out what's actually right or true. Probably true is a better word than right, although they both go together. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that was great. So I saw Kyle next and then Peter. So Kyle, please.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of echo what other people had said, but I think one component here is that the seeds of the politicalization of health and behavior related to health they've been stewing for a while, but then we have this sort of blowing up of the politicalization during the pandemic. And I think it's seeping over to things that are not just pandemic related. We see it looks like we're seeing more and more political divide based on consumption patterns in foods, right? And, there was a huge messaging campaign from one of the beef industry partners just a couple of months ago that was essentially saying, do you know a rancher? Do you want them to lose their home? And do you want them to, like, sort of this fear tactic to say, hey, don't be vegetarian because you're going to lose jobs. But then you see the exact same thing from other proponents, right? Where it says, hey, if you want to ruin industries or ruin communities, we need to stop investing in meat, and we need to do more local growing. And I think it's these behaviors, like we talked about yesterday, they're becoming a moral component because of we're so tied to our political identities. And that's just another sort of wedge that gets put into normal everyday people trying to live their lives. But, now everything about my health and every behavior is politicized, and that makes it tough to have a conversation. That makes it tough for our, to ask research questions and get the answer that we really need instead of maybe what we want. That's just my 2 cents.
Thank you for that. Peter, you're next.
Yeah, I think Terrence's question or comment is very interesting in the case of Sweden, because we've been known for having a very liberal strategy when it comes to COVID, and that strategy was, that's what they say at least, and as far as I know, that's the case. That was the EU strategy from the beginning, and everyone was supposed to follow that. And then, for different political reasons, other countries decided to do otherwise because they wanted to show that they were doing something, and not based on evidence or science, just based on political wills. And we have a very, very intense ongoing debate where the Public Health Authority, which few Swedes, I think, even know existed before COVID, is now the most famous institution in this country, and the state epidemiologist is the most well-known person. But still, they're losing legitimacy because of the debates and the questionings that are coming. Based on the fact that no one knew anything about COVID, and we didn't know what would happen. And so it's a very interesting case, and it's kind of an experiment, I suppose, going on right now. And still, it's an open question where it will end. But Sweden has had a tough time because the neighboring countries, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland, but Iceland is specific, of course, but Norway, Denmark, and Finland has had very, very fewer deaths per million inhabitants compared to Sweden. We have so much more. But then again, compared to other European countries, we're kind of in the middle of everything. So it's so. But compared to the other Nordic countries, that's the tough one for the public health authorities of Sweden at the moment. Yeah.
Sharon, please. Ilya, you had your hand up too, so you're next. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing everybody's hands. Sharon,
I would be interested. I'd be interested to hear what folks have. Sarah, you'd brought this up, talking about race, and you kind of alluded to acculturation, as did Peter in the comments. So I'd be curious to hear about how do we move health lifestyles theories forward, dealing with issues of acculturation and race. It's something that's really left out of what we do, and I think for a variety of good reasons we leave it out. This kind of reification of distinctions with this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how do we move this forward into that area.
I don't know. I'm curious what other people say. I have, like, when Adrian was talking, I was thinking about this acculturation paper that I started working on, I mean, like 6 years ago at this point. And at first thought we would submit it to a public health journal, and it was kind of making a critique based on our research and based on a little bit of what I talked about. And it just hasn't hit. We like kind of took a break, and now I'm going back, and it has been hard to articulate that critical perspective with the public health literature and to sort of like make a contribution. And I think at the same time, there is like a growing group of people within public health and within nutrition, like making these sociological arguments about how it's, you know, it's not just this measure of culture, and it's not just like change over time or this automatic thing that's linked to these structural factors. But I don't know how you kind of like move this conversation beyond where it feels like it's stuck.
Ilya, please.
Thanks so much. Sorry to kind of backtrack a little in terms of the questioning. I was just wondering, with some of the discussion, especially with respect to lifestyles during, in this case, the pandemic, but more broadly a pandemic, the conversation about politicization got me thinking of if people had thoughts on the difficulties of where you draw the boundaries on what is and is not a lifestyle. You know, with you could think of this in terms of, you know, you have the more obvious candidates like the masks and following the basic guidelines. But, you know, I wonder if you start wading into a kind of murky territory with like, you know, do you attend a small gathering, like, you know, like travel. It seems like it becomes a tricky concept where if everything, almost everything, you know, I think we've all seen the big charts, especially earlier on, like epidemiologists ranking what different activities are associated with different risk levels. I mean, you could argue that is indicative of some kind of health lifestyle approach, but those were so broad, you know, like everything, every conceivable social activity was being ranked in order of riskiness. How do you situate that into a cohesive framework?
That is such an interesting point, that so much of what we didn't used to think of as a health behavior has, in the context of the pandemic, become a health behavior. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's fabulous. It's really interesting.
And which of those behaviors are going to stick going forward? I was talking in my session yesterday about how I used to make fun of people who used hand sanitizer and would wear masks at planes, but I will continue to do that now. My whole view has changed, and I think that will be interesting to see the behaviors that stick after the pandemic, that stick moving forward.
And there's, I'm sorry, I was just gonna say that, and that, you know, I've heard like people, I think it was kind of came up a little early, like residual behaviors that are also not directly pandemic related, but are health behaviors like cooking and exercise. But like I've definitely been seeing mixed evidence on that. Like I just read something today that people's like attitudes towards vegetables have changed. At the same time, you hear a lot of people talking about like pandemic cooking fatigue. You know, everybody was excited about it, and now people are almost like, you wonder if people would cook less because, you know, they're like, I don't want to ever do this again in my life, you know. And so it's just, yeah, it's interesting to think of like all the strange repercussions going in different directions.
Someone else was starting to talk. I couldn't catch who it was.
It was me, but really, really fast because I want to leave room for the others. I think that point that Ilya's making speaks back to something that Bill had mentioned, that for me, there's an issue with lifestyle theory. We were stuck in this paradigm of equating health behaviors and lifestyle with risk factor epidemiology based on chronic diseases. So, you know, the usual suspects. And what this discussion is inviting us to think about is, with infectious diseases and broadening our way of thinking about health, do we see lifestyles in more of a Bourdieusian way, which is well beyond the typical cardiovascular risk factor epidemiology kind of thinking. That's it.
And I would say one thing more regarding the pandemic and health lifestyles, that's more on the kind of lifestyles creating inequalities side of things that Sarah was speaking to, and Peter. In our qualitative work, following the families that we talked to for 5 years, we basically were able to go back to them and talk to them twice during the pandemic, once with the parents and once with the teens in the family. And it was fascinating because, you know, 5 years previously, the parents had articulated their health lifestyle projects for their children to us. We came back to them in the pandemic and they were weaponizing them basically. So the most common narrative, and of course there was variation, but their most common narrative was, well, I can't control the pandemic, but what I can control is this really excellent lifestyle that my family has. And, you know, people had slightly different things that they emphasized, but they emphasized whatever it was they had always emphasized. And they said, you know, because of, let's say, our really clean diet or our high level of physical activity or whatever, like, this means this is what I can control. And this is why we are safe. And this is why we're not going to get COVID. And so in some cases, even pointing out to their kids how class and race disadvantaged folks, like say working in construction sites or whatever else, were putting themselves at risk, and kind of like creating these distinctions, creating these inequalities, using the lifestyle still as a tool, even in the pandemic when we were trying to talk to them about other stuff, to say why, well, because I have this lifestyle, this is keeping me safe from COVID. Whereas most of us are probably aware, like these privileged families were safe from COVID because they were living in a really privileged town. They had privileged jobs. They were able to keep themselves very isolated. And so it was just the same dynamic reproducing, which is kind of interesting to think about. Oh, and Ilya's saying in the chat that worked with pediatricians that, yeah, what they were saying was what we were expecting to hear, but there were only a couple of families that acknowledged being overwhelmed and unable to maintain the same kind of lifestyle as before. A couple families in survival mode, and the rest were in like superiority mode. It was really a little bit surprising.
Stephanie,
Yeah,
were your
the only thing
families?
that goes back to the question of which institutions are influential, are actually breaking into people's minds to change their behavior.
Yeah, it wasn't the pediatricians for these families. Sarah.
Were your families, they were mostly wealthy-ish families, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was some class variation, but the two communities were both middle and upper middle class, and the majority of the families were also middle and upper middle class. And even when they weren't themselves middle and upper middle class, they were performing the same performance of health lifestyles that were in those communities. Yeah. So absolutely.
I just think
privilege.
Thinking about the repercussions, I mean, this is what I always come back to, but like the exacerbation of these inequalities, in that some families have responded to the pandemic by like turning in and trying to control everything. And honestly, they can control a lot of things. Like they have the money to do it and they have the jobs to be able to do it. Whereas some families, like they've lost total control. You know, our families, like so many people have lost jobs, and it goes up and down. And then social assistance is kind of this roller coaster. And these things, now that we've been through this, like, which we didn't necessarily all expect at the beginning for an entire year, I think they will shape like how we think about health and behavior in a kind of long term going forward. And people's experience will have been so different in terms of how they experience control and risk and the trauma of all of this.
That's so well put. And I think given the timing, it's a good last word. What an amazing panel and what an amazing group of people speaking up here, both in the chat and verbally. Thank you so much for your engagement, and huge thank you to the 3 panelists. That was really, really cool. So we can go back to the main room now. People feel free to take a break. At the top of the hour is when we'll start the concluding panel on the future of health lifestyles research that Jaren, who was here and spoke for a bit, is going to be our moderator for. And so feel free to hang out in the main room if you'd like, or take a break, and hope to see you back at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, everybody.